For nearly a quarter of a century, Asafa Powell lived as if two people existed in one body. One stepped out before the world with powerful legs, a calm face, and the cold precision of a sprinter who needed less than 10 seconds to turn an entire stadium silent. The other lived behind those cheers, quietly carrying the family losses that came too early, the Olympic Games that did not end as hoped, the injuries that continually reminded him that even an extraordinary body has limits, a doping test that once placed his reputation under suspicious eyes, and private parts of his life that were finally dragged before the public for judgment. Powell was never one who liked to talk too much about pain. He did not build an image through dramatic confessions, nor did he turn his wounds into reasons to seek pity. Instead, he kept appearing at the starting blocks, kept training, kept running when others had begun to doubt, kept coming back after moments when it seemed his career had been stripped of yet another piece. Perhaps that is the most admirable will in Powell. Not the ability to run away from suffering, because he never truly managed to do that, but the ability to carry it with him while still moving forward. And precisely because of that, the numbers he left behind become all the more extraordinary. Powell once broke the world record in the 100 meters with 9.77 seconds in Athens in 2005, equaled that same mark twice in 2006, then lowered the record to 9.74 in Rio in 2007. 1 year later, he ran a personal best of 9.72 seconds, placing himself among the fastest 100-meter runners in history. In the 2006 season, Powell went undefeated in the 100 meters, recorded 12 legal sub-10-second runs in a single season, won Commonwealth Games gold, shared the Golden League jackpot, and was named World Athlete of the Year by World Athletics. At the World Championships, he won bronze in the 100 meters in Osaka in 2007 and Berlin in 2009, along with relay medals in the 4x100 meters, including gold in Berlin in 2009 and Beijing in 2015. In 2016, at the age of 33, he still took silver in the 60 meters at the World Indoor Championships before helping Jamaica win Olympic gold in the 4x100 meters in Rio with Johan Blake, Nicol Ashmead and Usain Bolt. Powell's sub-10-second 100-meter performances stood for many years at a level rare in sprint history, making the nickname Sub-10 King an inseparable part of his legacy. Not every championship ended the way he wanted, yet very few sprinters have ever combined absolute speed, competitive longevity, and the ability to repeat sub-10-second marks the way Asafa Powell did. Before continuing into the story behind the numbers 9.77, 9.74, and 9.72, please hit subscribe, leave a like and a heart as a sign of respect for the man who carried so many losses and still kept stepping to the starting line. Before the numbers 9.77, 9.74, or 9.72 ever appeared on the scoreboard and turned Asafa Powell into a name the entire world had to remember. He was only the youngest boy in a large family in Jamaica, where life was defined more by church, faith, work and responsibility than by applause or Olympic dreams. Asafa was born on November 23, 1982, the youngest of 6 brothers, raised in a Christian household where no child was allowed to think of himself as the center of everything. Under that roof, everything had to be shared. Space, the parents' time, clothes, the advice of older brothers, and even the small responsibilities that gradually taught the children that family always came before the individual. Church was not simply the place Powell appeared on Sundays. Faith was part of the rhythm of life, teaching him how to listen, to keep discipline, and to keep doing what needed to be done even when no one stood beside him to clap. Perhaps that environment itself created the Asafa the public would later often see. Quiet, averse to showing off, rarely trying to become the loudest person in the room. In a sport full of strong personalities, Powell was often different because of his calm. Yet as a child, there was no sign that the quiet boy was preparing to become the fastest man in the world. Athletics was not Asafa's childhood dream. He loved soccer more, once played forward for Charlemont High School and a local club, running not to break records but to find space, chase the ball and score goals. If life had gone another way, Powell might even have spent more time with engines than starting blocks. He loved cars, liked mechanics, and was interested in how machines worked. That interest did not disappear when fame arrived. Many years later, even after becoming a world record holder, Powell still liked to examine, adjust, and care for his own cars. Within the family, the person who showed Asafa that athletics could be a real path was his older brother Donovan Powell, a sprinter who had competed internationally and reached the 60-meter final at the World Indoor Championships in 1999. Asafa once went to Texas to stay with Donovan and saw the life of a professional athlete more closely. The repetitive training sessions, the care of the body, and the discipline behind the few seconds of competition that spectators saw. Yet even Donovan did not immediately see his youngest brother as a phenomenon who would change the history of the 100 meters. Asafa did not grow up with prophecies that one day the world would run after him. He only gradually discovered that the same speed that once served soccer could lead to a different path. Around 2001, when Powell began to take sprinting seriously and was running around 10.50 seconds, people in Jamaican athletics started to notice the tall frame, the natural power, and the acceleration that had not yet been fully polished. A new future began to take shape. But there was a particular cruelty in the way Powell's life opened at that moment. Just as the young man was beginning to understand how far he could go, the family that had been the most peaceful foundation of his life was about to be struck in its most painful place. Before the Olympics, world records or packed stadiums appeared, Asafa would have to learn a lesson that no coach could prepare him for. There are losses that age a person in a single day, and there are races that have no finish line to signal that the pain has ended. That lesson arrived earlier than anyone in the Powell family could have prepared for. In 2002, when Asafa was still only a young athlete trying to understand how far his speed might take him, the family received the news that Michael Powell, one of his older brothers, had been shot and killed while working as a taxi driver in New York. There was no medal to cling to, no reputation large enough to turn the pain into a story the whole world would know. Only a family in Jamaica forced to face the truth that a son who had left home to make a living would never return as before. For Asafa, it was not only the death of a brother, it was the first time his youth was cut across by a loss large enough to make every future plan suddenly fragile. At an age when most young athletes were still thinking about results, competition opportunities, and the first doors of a career, Asafa had to learn that there are moments that cannot be repaired by effort, cannot be run a second time, and cannot be reversed by trying harder. Michael was gone, and the family still had to wake up the next morning, still had to pray, still had to work, still had to live, even though a place in the house had become permanently empty. Yet the cruelest part was that the pain had not yet settled when another loss arrived. About a year later, Vaughn, another of Asafa's older brothers, suddenly collapsed while playing ball in Georgia and died. Two sons from the same family, left within so short a time that those who remained barely had enough space to understand what was happening. One died by violence on foreign soil. One vanished suddenly in a moment of sport that seemed ordinary. In a family with many brothers, the presence of each had been so familiar that no one thought it could become memory so quickly. And now the Powell parents had to endure the pain no father or mother ever wishes to experience, losing two sons while they themselves were still alive. For Asafa, those two deaths occurred exactly as he was beginning to step out of anonymity. A career was taking shape, yet the future no longer carried the simple color of a youthful dream. Every step forward now came with the bitter recognition that success could not protect a family from loss, that speed could not bring a person back, and that even if one day the whole world knew his name, it still could not fill the empty spaces that had appeared at home. What is notable is that Asafa did not allow grief to turn him into an entirely different person in public. He did not build an image from complaints, did not turn the two deaths into explanations for every later failure. Yet in what he has shared, it is clear that the loss changed the way he viewed responsibility. Powell has said that losing two older brothers in a short period became part of the motivation that made him want to make the family happy. It is a short statement, but beneath it lies a very large burden. Because when a family has already lost too much, those who remain sometimes begin to feel they must live better, must try harder, must bring back something bright enough to compensate for the days that were too dark. From then on, athletics was no longer only Asafa's story with himself. Every training session, every trip, every competition opportunity gradually carried another meaning. If he could succeed, if he could take the family to a better place, if he could create joy after the years in which they had only received bad news, then that speed might become something more valuable than a number on a clock. Faith also returned in this period, not as a miracle that would bring the dead back to life or make the pain disappear, but as a foundation that helped the family not collapse completely. Powell had grown up in a household where prayer was already part of daily life, and after the two deaths, faith was no longer merely habit. It became a way to accept that there are questions that will never have answers, losses that cannot be fully understood, and that people must still keep walking even when the heart is not ready. Asafa kept running not because he had overcome grief, but because sometimes continuing is the only form of survival. He was still a young man, still had much to learn about sprinting, still did not know what a world record felt like in his own experience, yet now every step forward carried the memory of two older brothers who would never see most of what was about to happen. That is precisely what gives Powell's later successes a very particular layer of sadness. When he stood on the podium, when his name was read before tens of thousands of people, when Jamaica began to look at him as a hope, somewhere in that story, there still existed two people who had left before the world had time to know who their younger brother would become. And while the Powell family was still learning how to live with two irreplaceable empty spaces, Stephen Francis began to see something else in Asafa. A rare combination of power, height, acceleration, and potential that had not yet been fully exploited. Life had just taken two of his older brothers, yet almost at the same time, the track opened a door larger than anything Asafa had ever imagined. That is the painful paradox that would follow him throughout his career. The darkest moments and the greatest opportunities sometimes appear so close together that a person does not know whether to cry for what has just been lost or to step forward toward what is coming. It was precisely in that period, while the Powell family was still having to learn how to keep living after losses too large, that Stephen Francis and the MVP Track and Field Club began to become the most important part of Asafa's athletic future. Francis did not look at him as a legend already predetermined, but as an athlete who possessed rare raw materials that were still very rough. Height near 1.90 meters, a long stride, natural power, notable acceleration, and a speed that, if placed in the right system, could take him far beyond domestic limits. But raw speed was not enough to survive at the international level. Francis began refining every small detail. The way Powell set his feet in the blocks, the body angle in the first meters, the ability to transition from acceleration into maximum velocity, the stability of each stride, and, most important of all, the discipline to repeat the same process every day. For someone who had come to serious sprinting relatively late, Asafa had to learn very quickly. Every hundredth of a second lost at the start, every stride a little too long or a little too short, every time the body tensed too much could become the difference between a Jamaican athlete with potential and someone capable of standing beside the best sprinters in the world. Powell answered that system with durable work capacity and a body that seemed to absorb training with surprising speed. His times began to drop clearly, and the name Asafa Powell was mentioned more and more often in Jamaican athletics. He was no longer simply the tall young man with fast legs. People began to see a sprinter who could maintain form, who could handle the pressure of competition, and, most importantly, who could take the speed from the training track into real races. The Commonwealth Games of 2002 were one of the first steps that showed this. Powell was part of the Jamaican 4x100-meter relay team that won silver, a result that did not make him a star but was enough to prove that someone who had only recently taken athletics seriously could already step onto the international stage and contribute to the national team. The competitions that followed gave him more than results. They gave him experience of the call room, the minutes of waiting before a race, the pressure of having to react precisely to the gun, and the feeling of standing next to opponents he had previously known only through results in the newspaper. Yet if those early races helped Powell understand that he belonged in that world, the World Championships in Paris in 2003 taught him a harsher lesson. At the highest level, a race can end before the legs have time to prove anything. In the 100-meter quarterfinals, Powell was disqualified for a false start under the rules of that time, in the same well-known incident involving John Drummond. For Powell, there was no chance to correct the mistake inside the race, no 100 meters in which to prove his speed. One movement too early, one moment of lost control, and his first major championship was closed. That is a particularly cruel kind of failure for a sprinter. Months of preparation can be erased in less than a second, but Powell did not turn that incident into an ending. Francis continued to do what he had done from the beginning, returning the athlete to technique, routine, and the details that could be controlled. There was no magic at MVP, only thousands of starts, strength training sessions, small adjustments to posture and acceleration, and the patience required for a body rich in potential to become more reliable. Powell also did not need to be convinced that he was already a star. He still had to prove it every day through work. The combination of Francis's strict system and Powell's physical gifts made the speed continue to rise faster than many people expected. By 2004, Asafa was no longer a name on the margins of Jamaican sprinting. He was already fast enough to be regarded as one of those capable of contending in the 100 meters on the biggest stage, and Athens was no longer a trip for learning. For the first time, he arrived at the Olympics as a genuine contender, carrying speed, the expectations of Jamaica, and all the years the family had endured so that he could stand there. But the Olympics do not care how much a person has lost to reach the starting line. They care only about what happens after the gun. Athens in 2004 was therefore no longer a trip for accumulating experience. Powell entered the Olympics with enough speed to make Jamaica believe that something great could happen, and he himself had already gone too far beyond the position of a rising talent to still be allowed to treat failure as a gentle lesson. The Olympic 100 meters has always been one of the most ruthless races in world sport. An entire sprinter's career can be compressed into less than 10 seconds, where a slow reaction, an imperfect transition, or only a few hundredths of a second is enough to change how history remembers a person. Powell advanced through the rounds and into the final, where the biggest names gathered on the same track. When the gun sounded, he had speed, he had power, and he had all the months of training behind him. Yet the Olympics do not award potential. Justin Gatlin took gold in 9.85 seconds. Francis Obikwelu took silver. Maurice Green took bronze, and Powell finished fifth in 9.94. For very many athletes, reaching an Olympic final and placing fifth would be a lifetime achievement. But for someone who was beginning to be looked at as the future of Jamaican sprinting, that result left a hard-to-avoid emptiness. Powell did not fail because he was not fast enough to belong on that stage. On the contrary, it was precisely the fact that he was fast enough that made the feeling of falling short clearer. He had been there, in the biggest race, close enough to see the medals, yet when the results board appeared, the first Olympic dream still did not belong to him. Athens became the place where Powell understood that between possessing world-class speed and stepping onto an Olympic podium, there exists a gap small enough to be cruel, yet large enough to change an entire story. There is no need to call it a collapse. It was simply the first time he left a major stage with the feeling that what the body was capable of had still not been converted into what he wanted most. And perhaps that is why what happened 1 year later in the same city became special, almost beyond the possibility of writing a more perfect script. On June 14, 2005, Powell returned to Athens for a meeting that did not carry the weight of the Olympics, yet at the very place that had left the greatest disappointment, he ran the 100 meters in 9.77 seconds. When the scoreboard showed that number, Asafa Powell's entire position in athletics changed. He was no longer merely a contender, no longer a Jamaican sprinter full of potential. 9.77 was a new world record, faster than the standard Tim Montgomery had previously set, and in a few seconds the man who had finished fifth at the Olympics became the fastest man on the planet. Athens had not changed. The lanes were still there. The summer atmosphere was the same. Yet for Powell, that city now carried two completely opposite memories. 1 year earlier, it had reminded him that speed was not necessarily enough to bring an Olympic medal. 1 year later, it confirmed that no man on Earth had ever been recognized as running the 100 meters faster than he had under legal conditions. For Jamaica, the meaning was larger than a number. Before Usain Bolt appeared and made the world accustomed to the image of the Jamaican flag flying after records, Powell had already placed the island's men's sprinting at the center. From a country that already possessed a strong athletics tradition, but had not yet owned a global dominating symbol in the men's 100 meters in this way, Jamaica now had the man who held the standard of the fastest event. Powell became the name that American, European, and Caribbean sprinters had to look at when speaking of the limits of the 100 meters. That also changed his own life. A man who had been used to keeping distance from noise could no longer easily step into a stadium as an ordinary competitor. From the moment 9.77 appeared, beside the name Asafa Powell, there was always an additional phrase, world record holder. Every race he entered was viewed through that title. People wanted to see whether he would break the record again, whether he would run under 10 seconds again, whether he could defeat every opponent. There were more interviews, greater attention, more handshakes from strangers, and Powell once admitted that fame brought additional responsibility as well as pressure. The quiet man now had to live in a world where everyone wanted a piece of his time, while every small failure also became more noticeable than before. Success gave him financial freedom, reputation, and opportunity. Yet at the same time, it took away something simpler, the right to step into a race without being regarded as the one who had to win. From then on, Powell no longer ran only against the 7 opponents beside him. He also ran with 9.77 on his back, with the expectations of Jamaica, with the curiosity of the entire world, and with the growing question of whether the fastest man on the planet could turn that speed into a genuine era. The world record had answered one question decisively. Asafa Powell was fast enough. But precisely because that question had disappeared, another question began to weigh far more heavily. If he truly was the fastest man in the world, how much longer would the rest of the world have to wait to see him dominate the way a fastest man in the world was supposed to? And in 2006, Powell began to answer that question in the strongest way possible. Not through a single moment, but through an entire season that almost never allowed people time to doubt. From Melbourne to the major meetings in Europe, he continually stepped onto the track as the man who had to be beaten, then left it with the feeling that the gap between himself and the rest was growing clearer. At the Commonwealth Games, Powell won gold in the 100 meters, consolidating Jamaica's #1 position and showing that the 9.77 of the previous year had not been a flash that appeared and then vanished. Yet it was the consistency that turned the 2006 season into one of the most memorable years of his career. Powell ran under 10 seconds legally 12 times in a single season, an extraordinary number in an era when breaking the 10-second barrier was still a threshold only a few sprinters in the world could reach regularly. For many athletes, a single 9.9 was enough to mark an entire year. For Powell, performances like that began to appear with a density that almost made people forget how difficult they were. He was not only fast when conditions were perfect or when adrenaline rose high in a special race. He was fast in different cities, on different tracks, against different opponents, across a long and demanding competition calendar. Twice that year, Powell also equaled his own world record of 9.77 in Gateshead and then in Zurich, as if the number once regarded as a new human limit had become a speed zone he could return to more than once. That mattered more than simply owning a single record. A world record can sometimes be explained by a perfect competition day, ideal conditions, and a body reaching its best state once. But repeating the same standard at different times turned Powell into something more frightening to opponents. A sprinter who not only had the ability to create miracles, but could also live near that miracle throughout an entire season. The Golden League made that image even clearer. Powell continued to win the major races, accumulating a string of results that made him almost the fixed image of the #1 position every time his name appeared on a start list. There are seasons in which an athlete wins because opponents are absent, because the schedule is favorable, or because of one unexpected explosive race. Powell's 2006 did not feel like that. It felt like a process of control. He ran, won, recovered, moved to another country, then ran under 10 seconds again. The same tall body, the same low-expression demeanor, the same powerful drive out of the blocks, and the gradual transition into maximum velocity with a smoothness that left many opponents seeing only his back in the final meters. At the end of the year, World Athletics awarded Powell the title of World Athlete of the Year, the recognition deserved for a season in which he was not only the world record holder, but also the most consistent sprinter on the planet. That title placed him at the highest tier of global athletics. Yet what is notable is that Powell's life off the track still did not carry the style of someone who wanted to turn fame into a second stage. He still kept his interest in cars and mechanics, still spent time examining vehicles, upgrading them, and treating that as a private world where there were no rankings or starting guns. While the press spoke of hundredths of a second, Powell could speak of engines, turbos, or how a machine operated. That ordinariness became a rare form of balance between an ever-growing competition calendar and a life under increasing attention. Success also began to allow him to do concrete things for the family. When he received the financial prize that came with the end-of-year title, Powell spoke of helping his younger sister, who had just finished cosmetology school, open her own salon. That detail is small when placed beside the records and medals, yet it says a great deal about how he used success, not only to buy more things for himself, but to turn speed into opportunity for those at home. The year 2006, therefore, almost contained everything a sprinter could wish for. Commonwealth gold, major victories, the Golden League, 2 equalings of the world record, a string of sub-10-second runs, and the Athlete of the Year title. Powell no longer needed to prove that he belonged to the elite. He was the elite standard. Every time he crouched into the blocks, opponents were not only running against Asafa Powell, they were running against the man who held the fastest time in the world, and a season in which almost no one could find a clear weakness. Yet precisely because he had pushed the standard so high, entering 2007 the expectations also changed. People were no longer satisfied to see Powell win another meeting or run another 9.9. The 2006 season had made everyone believe that something larger had to come, and when the World Championships in Osaka appeared ahead, Powell arrived in Japan not merely as a contender, he arrived carrying the weight of a nearly perfect season behind him, and with the highest level of expectation he had ever had to take into a championship. Osaka, in 2007, was therefore not simply another World Championships. For Asafa Powell, it felt like the stage on which all the victories of the previous year were simultaneously demanding a final confirmation. He arrived in Japan as the world record holder, with the nearly perfect 2006 season behind him, with the reputation of a sprinter who could continually run under 10 seconds, and with the expectation that this time that speed would be converted into the largest individual title. But the 100 meters does not care how many races a person has already won. In the final, Tyson Gay took the victory, Derek Atkins finished second, and Powell had only the bronze medal. For the majority of athletes in the world, a World Championships medal is an achievement enough to be proud of for a lifetime. Yet Powell had unintentionally created a standard too high for himself. He did not enter Osaka as an outsider who had merely been lucky to reach the podium. He entered with a world record, with a string of victories, and with the image of the fastest man on the planet. Therefore, the bronze was not viewed as an ordinary success. It was viewed as evidence for a question that the media began to pose more and more loudly. Why could Asafa Powell look almost invincible in the meetings? Yet when a championship final arrived, the result did not match what the stopwatch had promised. From this point, the gap between the two versions of Powell became clearer in the way the public told his story. One version appeared in the Golden League, the European races, and the long seasons, where he regularly broke the 10-second barrier and defeated the strongest opponents. The other version appeared in the races the whole world remembers longest, where a single run decides how people view an entire year of preparation. That difference itself caused harsh evaluative labels to begin appearing. Some people called Powell a choker, as if a single word could explain the entire complexity of elite sprinting. Yet that was never a diagnosis or an objective truth about the man. It was only the way a portion of the media and fans tried to compress an uncomfortable paradox. A person fast enough to hold the world record, yet without the major individual gold they believed that speed ought to bring. And what made the paradox more painful was that Powell did not become slower after Osaka. Only a few days later, in Rieti, Italy, he ran 9.74 seconds and once again broke the world record. That was a moment that almost defied every simple explanation. If Osaka made people doubt whether Powell could produce his best in the biggest moments, Rieti immediately reminded the entire world that in pure speed he was still in a place almost no one else could reach. A bronze medal and a new world record appeared so close together that they became two sides of the same career. People could look at 9.74 and see a genius. They could look at Osaka and see an unanswered question. The cruelty is that public memory is often drawn more strongly toward what is still missing than toward what has already been achieved. Powell already possessed what nearly every sprinter on the planet only dares to dream of: a world record, dominating seasons, a string of sub-10-second runs, the Athlete of the Year title. Yet the more he achieved, the shorter the list of things he still lacked became, and therefore the easier it was to see. A major individual gold became the empty space that every other achievement seemed unable to make people forget. That does not mean Osaka erased Powell's greatness. On the contrary, it was precisely the greatness that made the bronze feel like disappointment. If he had been only a very good sprinter, people would have called it a success. But because Powell was the fastest man in the world, they wanted more. And from this point his career began to live under a particularly harsh form of judgment. Every victory in a meeting only confirmed what the world already knew, while every failure to win a championship was used to question something deeper than speed. Powell continued to run, continued to be the benchmark, continued to step into races with the ability to make the scoreboard display historic numbers. Yet 2007 had changed the way people looked at him. The stopwatch said Asafa Powell had never been faster. The headlines began asking why a man that fast still did not have what they considered necessary to complete a legend. And while Powell was still living between those two ways of seeing, Jamaica began to produce another tall, unusual young talent who was about to change the entire story once more. His name was Usain Bolt, and from this point Powell's problem would no longer be only whether he could win a championship. It would become a far more painful question: what happens when a man who was once the standard of speed has to watch that very standard be rewritten right before his eyes? Yet before Usain Bolt became the name that made the entire world redefine the limits of speed, Asafa Powell had already been the one who placed Jamaica at the center of global men's sprinting. He did not enter the Bolt era as someone who had stood behind from the beginning. On the contrary, Powell himself had once been the standard, the world record holder, world athlete of the year, the sprinter the strongest opponents had to look at to know how fast the 100 meters was being run. That made Beijing 2008 a particularly painful turning point in the way history remembers him. Powell arrived at the Olympics with a resume large enough to be regarded as a genuine contender, yet in the 100-meter final he finished fifth. Meanwhile, Usain Bolt drove through the finish in 9.69 seconds, breaking the world record and creating a moment that almost instantly changed the entire sport. In less than 10 seconds, the center of gravity of Jamaican sprinting shifted. Powell had been the man the whole world had to chase. Now a younger, taller, more free-spirited and faster teammate had surpassed the very standard Powell had once built. Yet that story should not be told as a personal confrontation. There is no basis for turning Powell and Bolt into two men divided by jealousy or resentment. What matters more lies in the history. Bolt did not need to destroy Powell in order to change his place in public memory. All that was required was for Bolt to run faster, win bigger, and do it on the Olympic stage, and the world automatically began looking toward the new man. From then on, Asafa was gradually attached to a phrase far simpler than his actual career. The record holder before Bolt, the man before Bolt appeared. And that is a somewhat cruel simplification because Powell was still running at a level that almost the entire rest of humanity could not touch. Only a few weeks after Beijing, on September 2, 2008 in Lausanne, Powell ran 9.72 seconds, the fastest personal performance of his entire career. That created a paradox almost painful in the logic of elite sport. The Olympics had ended. The 100-meter medals had been awarded. Bolt had become a global symbol. Yet Powell's body had just produced the fastest run of his life. 9.72 proved that speed had not abandoned Asafa. Looking only at the stopwatch, he was still advancing. Looking at the public narrative, his era seemed to be slipping behind. That is one of the moments that shows why Powell's career cannot be understood only through wins and losses. A person can run the fastest of his life and still feel that history has already passed him by on the biggest stage only a few weeks earlier. Beijing also brought another Olympic story. Jamaica won the men's 4x100-meter relay, with Powell contributing to the team that created one of the memorable moments of the country's sprinting. At the time, the gold medal seemed to bring a measure of compensation for the personal disappointment in the 100 meters and to strengthen Powell's place in the generation that had lifted Jamaica to the Olympic summit. Yet many years later, that result was changed. A retested sample from Nesta Carter returned positive for methylhexanamine, causing the Jamaican team to be stripped of the Beijing 2008 gold medal. Powell was not the person who committed the violation, yet the consequence still entered his record. An Olympic medal he had once won on the track disappeared from the official record because of an action outside his control. This was again a very different form of loss in Powell's story. Athens 2004 and the Beijing 100 meters were races he had directly participated in and had to accept the results. But the Beijing relay medal was taken away many years later, when the race had already become memory and he could not run again to change anything. Once more, Powell's history was rewritten by something that lay outside his own legs. In the space of a few short years, he had experienced a rare shift in position, from world record holder and #1 symbol of Jamaican sprinting to a man standing in the same generation as a phenomenon so large that it nearly swallowed every comparison. Yet that did not make what Powell had already done smaller. On the contrary, looking back in the correct chronological order only shows how important he was. Before Jamaica grew accustomed to owning the fastest man in the world, Powell had been the first of that generation to make it a reality. Before Bolt made 9.6 a symbol, Powell had made 9.7 the standard the entire world had to chase. The tragedy does not lie in his becoming slower. The tragedy lies in the fact that he was still extremely fast at the exact moment another person appeared and pushed the concept of fast to a level no one had ever seen. And then, as Powell tried to continue in that new era, another opponent began to appear, one that did not stand in the lane beside him, did not have a name on the start list, and could not be defeated by a better acceleration. That opponent was his own body. The thing that had once lifted Asafa Powell to the top of the world, but was about to begin reclaiming, piece by piece, the career he had spent so much to build, and that body truly began to demand the price of speed in a slow but ruthless way. For a 100-meter sprinter, the body is not merely a vehicle for competing, it is the entire profession. An overly strained groin, an unstable hamstring, a back pain that alters running posture can render months of preparation meaningless. Powell had already understood this early, from 2005, when groin problems appeared exactly in the period he was rising to the top. At that time, people could look at 9.77 and think his body was nearly perfect. Yet behind the races lay a harsher reality. To run that fast, every muscle group had to work at a limit where even a very small deviation was enough to create injury. In the years that followed, the problems never completely disappeared. They returned in different forms, from the groin to the hamstring and then the back. forcing Powell to divide his time not only for training but also for treatment, recovery, and difficult decisions about when the body could be pushed back to maximum speed. In 2010, that became especially clear. After the summer races, groin issues began to pull discomfort into the back and hamstrings. Powell could not train at the 100% level an elite sprinter needs in order to maintain every hundredth of a second. He had to undergo treatment frequently, at times twice a day, while every return to high intensity came with the question of whether the body would hold. To outsiders, a sprinter only needs to run 10 seconds. Yet to produce those 10 seconds, the body must endure thousands of accelerations, hundreds of strength training sessions, repeated block starts, and a competition calendar stretched across many countries. Injury, therefore, does not only take away race day, it takes away rhythm, confidence in placing full power into every stride, and most importantly, time. For Powell, time had always been the most haunting unit, yet now it no longer resided only on the competition clock. It resided in the number of weeks that had to be rested, the number of days without sprinting, and the number of championships that passed while the body was not yet ready. By 2011, that cruelty reached one of the most painful points of the career. Powell ran 9.78 seconds in the season, the fastest time in the world that year. The number was especially important because it showed that even after many years at the top, even after Bolt had changed the standard of sprinting, and even after the body had warned him many times, Asafa still possessed enough speed to enter the World Championships in Daegu as a genuine contender. 9.78 was not the performance of a man living on past reputation. It was proof that he could still run faster than anyone else in the world that season. Yet at the exact moment that opportunity appeared, the groin flared again. Powell felt pain after the race in Budapest at the end of July, and was forced to stop training for several days. When he tried to return to sprinting, the problem flared once more. Treatment continued, hope remained, yet a championship does not wait for a body to recover according to its own schedule. In the end, Powell had to withdraw from the 100-meter event in Daegu. That was a disappointment of an entirely different kind from Osaka or Beijing. In those places, Powell had at least stood in the blocks, heard the gun, and had the chance for fate to be decided in 100 meters. Daegu did not give him that. The man who owned the fastest time in the world that season had to stand outside the most important race of the year because the body could not guarantee it would withstand what he asked of it. There is something especially painful in knowing one is fast enough to compete, yet not healthy enough to be allowed to try. No opponent passed Powell in the Daegu 100 meters because he could not enter the battle. No results board can explain that feeling. There is only an opportunity that vanished from history and can never be run again. For a sprinter already past the early years of a career, missing a championship is not the same as missing a meeting. World championships arrive only in cycles, the Olympics even more sparsely, and the body does not return to the age of 22 simply because an opportunity has been lost. Every season that passes makes the question of how many chances remain clearer. Powell continued treatment, continued trying to bring the body back to a state in which it could sprint, yet the relationship between him and his own body had changed. Previously, the body had been something he could trust to produce 9.77, 9.74, or 9.72. Now every maximal acceleration carried a risk he understood too well. And that is perhaps one of the most ruthless paradoxes of elite athletics. The more talent one has to drive the body near the limits of human possibility, the more one must live with the chance that those very limits will return to collect the price. Daegu closed without Powell having the opportunity to prove what 9.78 might have become in a final. Yet time did not stop for him to regret. The London Olympics already stood ahead, less than a year away, and for a man who had already lived through Athens, Beijing, and too many seasons of fighting injury, every major opportunity now carried the feeling that it could not be wasted again. Powell still had speed, he still had will, yet the question began to shift from whether he was fast enough to something far more frightening. Whether the body would allow him to use that speed on the most important day. London 2012 was therefore no longer simply another Olympics. For Powell, it carried the feeling of a door gradually narrowing. Athens had passed, Beijing had passed, and at nearly 30 years old, he understood that the number of chances to win an individual Olympic medal was no longer as large as before. The 100-meter final in London again gathered a terrifying generation: Usain Bolt, Johann Blake, Justin Gatlin, Tyson Gay, and Asafa Powell, names that made that race one of the strongest confrontations in Olympic sprint history. Powell stepped into the blocks, no longer the young man allowed to say there would still be a next time. He had once been the world record holder, had once run 9.72, had once been called one of the greatest sprinters of the era, yet an individual Olympic medal remained the large empty space in his resume. When the gun sounded, all those years were compressed into less than 10 seconds. Powell drove out, trying to keep himself in the race, but in the final meters, the thing a sprinter fears most happened. His hamstring gave way right in the race. The rhythm changed, the speed dropped, and while those ahead continued accelerating toward the finish, Powell could no longer demand from his body what it had done thousands of times in his life. He still finished the race, but in 7th place with 11.99 seconds, a number that cannot be read as an ordinary result. It did not say that Asafa Powell had suddenly become a man who ran the 100 meters in nearly 12 seconds. It only showed a body injured in the middle of an Olympic final. Bolt took gold, Blake silver, Gatlin bronze, and Powell walked out of yet another Olympics without an individual medal, this time in a more painful way because he was not even allowed to show the best version of himself through the full 100 meters. For a man defined by acceleration, power, and the ability to hold speed when opponents began to slow, the feeling of being braked by his own body in the most important race was almost the perfect betrayal. In earlier years, Powell could look at a failure and ask himself whether he had started poorly, whether he had held form long enough, or how the race tactics might have been different. London left less room for those questions. When the hamstring could not hold, willpower could not replace muscle fiber. Reputation could not heal the leg. An old world record could not give him another race. An athlete can spend a lifetime building the body into a machine of near absolute precision, yet a single moment is enough to remind that it remains a human body. What made London even sadder was that Powell already knew too well how Olympic time worked. 4 years is not a short break in sprinting. From Athens to Beijing, then from Beijing to London, each cycle took away more youth, more recovery capacity, and another portion of the scarce opportunities an elite athlete receives. After London, the question was no longer simply whether Powell could return to an Olympic individual final once more. The question was how many more years his body could withstand the level of violence that elite 100-meter sprinting demands. Yet the most pitiable thing about London was not the 7th-place finish. It was that a man who had spent more than a decade controlling every final stride ultimately lost that control in the very moment he needed it most. Powell was not beaten by any single opponent that day. He was reminded by the limits of his own body that even the fastest men in history are not exempt from fragility. And though it hurt, he still had to do what he had done many times before: leave the stadium, begin recovery, and try to find a way back. But 2013 prepared for him a crisis of an entirely different kind. London had made Powell doubt whether his body would still allow him to run as before. Only 1 year later, a test result would make others begin to doubt the entire story of the man and his career. This time, what was threatened was no longer only a hamstring or a lost Olympic medal. It would be the reputation Asafa Powell had spent nearly a lifetime building. 2013 therefore arrived for Powell at a time when he was already far too familiar with being challenged by things outside his wishes, yet this time the problem no longer lay in a torn muscle or a lost Olympic medal. At the Jamaican Championships in June of that year, Powell competed in the 100 meters but did not earn a place for the World Championships in Moscow. And after the meet, his sample returned positive for oxylofrin, a stimulant on the prohibited list in competition. A single result like that was enough to change completely the way the public looked at an athlete. Powell did not deny that his sample contained a banned substance, yet from the beginning he insisted he had not deliberately used oxylofrin to improve performance. The story that followed centered on a supplement called Epiphany D1 that he said he had used during preparation. In anti-doping, however, intention and responsibility are not always the same question. An athlete may not intentionally take a prohibited substance yet still remain responsible for what enters the body. That is precisely the gray area that made Powell's case far more complex than a simple headline containing the word positive. Initially, the Jamaica Anti-Doping Disciplinary Panel imposed an 18-month ban. For a sprinter already past 30, 18 months was not merely a period on paper. It could be a very large part of the remaining competitive life, in a sport where maximum speed and recovery capacity are both taken away piece by age. Powell appealed to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. In the review process, CAS accepted on the basis of balance of probabilities that oxylafron had entered his body through Epiphany D1. The panel also did not conclude that Powell had deliberately used oxylafron to enhance performance. Yet that did not mean he was declared entirely without fault. CAS still found that Powell had not exercised the full degree of caution required regarding the supplement he used, and in the anti-doping system the duty to check what enters the body ultimately belongs to the athlete. Therefore, the sanction did not disappear completely, but was reduced from 18 months to 6 months, counted from the sample collection date of June 21, 2013. That period had in practice already been served. This distinction is very important when looking back at the case. Powell could not simply say that nothing had happened, because a prohibited substance was genuinely detected, and CAS still determined he bore a degree of fault in controlling the supplement. Yet it is also unfair if the story is reduced to a former world record holder being caught deliberately using doping to run faster, because the KS decision did not reach that conclusion. The truth lay in a more complicated space. A banned substance had entered his body. The source from the supplement was accepted by KS as more probable than not. Intent to enhance performance was not established, yet professional responsibility remained. And for public reputation, that nuance almost always arrives too late. Headlines move faster than legal rulings. When a name like Asafa Powell stands next to the word doping, many people do not wait to read dozens of pages of a KS decision to understand the difference between intentional cheating, supplement contamination, and negligence. They only see a man who once held the world record, who once ran 9.77, then 9.74, who was once World Athlete of the Year, now with a positive test attached to his name. In that moment, it was not only the 2013 season that was re-examined in the public eye. Achievements from many earlier years also risked being covered by a layer of suspicion that Powell could not control by running fast one more time. That is perhaps the most particular form of damage for an athlete who has spent a lifetime building reputation through precise numbers. A race can be measured to hundredths of a second. A world record can be confirmed by photo finish, wind reading, and the timing system. But reputation does not operate with that precision. It can take many years to form and only one headline to change. Powell once described the suspension period as a very heavy blow, close to the feeling of a family loss. There is no need to turn that statement into an absolute comparison to understand why. The peak years of a sprinter are finite. One cannot reclaim the ages of 31, 32, or 33 after they have passed. Every month outside competition meant races that could not be run, income that could not be earned, and opportunities that the competition calendar would not return simply because a sanction was later reduced. Yet perhaps more painful was the feeling of having to defend the story of an entire career before people who now looked at it with different eyes. Powell no longer only had to rehabilitate the body, he had to rehabilitate trust. CAS ultimately reduced the ban to 6 months, opening the path for him to return to competition far sooner than the original decision. But being allowed to return did not mean everything returned to its former place. There are wounds that do not appear on an MRI. They lie in the way a person's name is mentioned, in the questions at press conferences, in the way old achievements suddenly sit under a new light. Powell could have chosen to walk away and let the controversy become the final mark on a career already full of upheaval. He did not. When the competition door reopened, he stepped through it. Yet from that moment, every time Asafa Powell crouched into the starting blocks would no longer be only an effort to prove he still had speed. It would also be the act of a man trying to reclaim the right to be remembered for his entire life, rather than for a single test sample. But there was another part of Asafa Powell's life that speed could not help him reclaim control over as easily as on the track: private life. For most of his career, Powell had grown used to keeping distance between the person who appeared before the public and what happened inside the family. He was not the type of celebrity who turned every relationship into content, nor did he build an image by recounting the details of his emotional life that once helped him protect a rare private zone through the years when almost every race was scrutinized. Yet silence only protects a person when others also accept that the empty space should remain. Around 2020, a portion of Powell's personal life was brought before the public through a matter involving child maintenance and paternity at the family court in Jamaica. According to what local press reported at the time, the mother of a young girl had requested that the monthly support amount be adjusted upward, while Powell asked for a DNA test to confirm paternity. The court reserved judgment while awaiting the results, and there were limits on the public disclosure of details. Yet even that was enough for a story that belonged to family space to become material for headlines, commentary, and judgment from people who did not directly live in that situation. Powell had children from before his later marriage, and that itself made his private life easy to reduce to keywords simpler than reality. A famous man, multiple children, past relationships, a maintenance case, only a few such lines, and the public could construct the rest of the story even without the full information. In 2021, Powell decided to speak publicly to refute the way he was being portrayed as a deadbeat dad. According to Powell, he loved and cared for his children and affirmed that he had fulfilled financial responsibility toward them. He also explained that some press descriptions of past relationships did not reflect the way he viewed the story. The specific details about when he learned of a child's existence, the relationship with the child's mother, or the degree of contact in each period should be understood as Powell's own account, not an absolute judgment from outside. Yet the fact that he had to speak those things himself already showed an important change. For most of his career, Powell could let the stopwatch answer for him. If people doubted his speed, he ran 9.77. If they thought he was past his peak, he ran 9.72. If reputation wavered, he could return to the starting blocks and try to rebuild through performance. Private life does not operate that way. There is no scoreboard that lights up after a family dispute to confirm who loved enough, who sacrificed more, or who was wrong to what degree. Relationships are not measured in hundredths of a second, and a man long accustomed to silence sometimes discovers that silence is no longer neutral. It can become an empty space for others to fill with speculation. For Powell, having to publicly defend the image of a father was certainly a very different experience from answering questions after a race. This was no longer a question of whether he had started well or why the final 60 meters had slowed. It touched personal character, responsibility, and the way the people closest to him were viewed by the public. What matters is not to turn this period into either an indictment or a simple exoneration story. Family disputes can rarely be fully understood from a few newspaper articles. There are legal obligations, private emotions, histories between individuals that outsiders cannot see completely. Yet for Powell's story, the episode showed the price of fame at another level. Reputation amplifies victories, but it also turns the most difficult parts of personal life into public property in the eyes of many people. A man who had spent years keeping private life behind the final door ultimately had to step out and say, "This is how I see my own story." And that is perhaps the most painful thing for a private person, not the existence of secrets, but the moment when silence no longer helps preserve dignity in the way one wishes. Yet even as Powell began to open up more about certain parts of his personal life, another phase was also gradually taking shape. No longer only the story of past disputes or things he was forced to explain before the public, he began to step into a more stable and clearer family image with Alicia. And this time, instead of letting the world see Asafa Powell only in the 10 seconds of a race, He gradually allowed people to see a portion of the human being who existed after the gun had fallen silent and the stadium had emptied. And it was precisely in that period that the public image of Asafa Powell began to change in a way those who had followed him from the time of 9.77 could scarcely have imagined. Alesha Miller Powell entered his life not from a stadium or an athletic ceremony, but from Instagram. Powell once shared that he himself had been the one to initiate the conversation. Then the early exchanges gradually stretched into many months of talking. For a man long known for being private and rarely allowing personal life to cross the family boundary, the relationship developed in a quite ordinary way. Messaging, getting to know each other, then finally meeting in person when Alicia came to Jamaica. There was no starting gun, no tens of thousands watching, and no scoreboard deciding who won or lost. There were only two people stepping into each other's lives outside everything that had previously defined Powell. The relationship led to marriage in 2019 in a private ceremony in Jamaica. And from then on, Asafa Powell gradually appeared before the public in a different role. People had been used to seeing him in a competition singlet, face tense before a race, or answering questions about Bolt, world records and championships. Now they began to see a husband, a father, a man who could smile in moments completely unrelated to sprinting. Through the family content that Powell and Alicia later shared, the public was allowed to see a life entirely different from the stadiums where he had once been judged by hundredths of a second. There were days centered on the children, school activities, sports day, conversations at home, small stories about athletics and the ordinary things any family experiences. For Powell, that change was almost a relearning of time. For most of his adult lifetime had been the harshest thing he had ever known. 0.01 of a second could decide ranking. A reaction one beat slower could alter an entire race. An injury season could take away an opportunity that would not return for 4 years. A sprinter lives in a world where value is sometimes compressed into numbers so small that ordinary people can barely feel them. Fatherhood demanded an entirely different kind of time. Not 9.72 or 9.77, but years of presence. Not one perfect day, but hundreds of ordinary days. Not becoming the fastest man in 10 seconds, but still being there after 10 years. Perhaps that is why family brought Powell a more mature definition of success. World records can be broken, medals can be stripped from the record, headlines can change, but an afternoon beside a child, a sports day, a family meal or a conversation in which no one cares how fast he once ran, belongs to a kind of achievement that no one else can surpass on a ranking list. Powell's greater openness also made his public image less one-dimensional. For many years, people had often read him through silence, calm, hard to predict, sometimes distant. When family life was shared more, a gentler version appeared, sometimes humorous, sometimes very ordinary, unlike the image of the man who always carried on his shoulders the pressure to prove himself in less than 10 seconds. That does not mean marriage or fatherhood erased the painful parts of the past. A new family cannot restore those who were lost, rewrite the Olympics that had already passed, or make the controversy as if it had never happened. Yet it gave Powell a place where he did not need to be the former world record holder every day. At home, the more important titles could simply be husband, father, the person present when a child needed him. And for a man who had spent too many years running for the expectations of a nation, of sponsors, of spectators, and sometimes of history itself, learning how to come home may have been a form of victory that his younger self had never imagined. Still, athletics had not completely released Powell. The body was older, the peak years already behind, yet one final Olympic chapter still lay ahead. After Athens with a 5th-place finish, Beijing with another 5th place, London with a hamstring that would not allow him to finish the race as he wished, Powell still had the chance to step into another Olympics. This time he no longer arrived as the man the whole world had to chase. Yet perhaps precisely because of that, Rio 2016 held the possibility of giving him a memory that the 3 previous Olympics had never managed. A time of leaving the stadium when what remained was not the question what if, but the feeling that at last something truly belonged to him. And Rio 2016 finally gave Powell that memory. But to get there, he had to do something many people had doubted after 2013. Come back long enough, strong enough and fast enough to still have a place in the sprint elite. When the ban ended and the door to competition reopened, Powell did not return as a young man just beginning his career. He came back with age, with a body that had endured many years of injury, and with a name that still carried the aftertaste of the oxylafrine case. Every race was now not only a test of speed, but also proof that controversy could not automatically turn the rest of his career into empty space. Powell continued to compete at a high level, still ran fast, still capable of competing with a younger generation, and that very durability became an important part of his legacy. At the World Championships 2015 in Beijing, he was part of the Jamaican team that won gold in the 4x100 meters, adding another world title to his record at a time when many sprinters of the same generation had already begun to move away from the peak. Early in 2016, Powell also showed that his indoor speed had not disappeared when he won silver in the 60 meters at the World Indoor Championships in Portland with 6.50 seconds. For a man already 33 years old, and who had spent more than a decade living at the limit of his body, still being able to stand on a world podium was a reminder that greatness does not lie only in personal bests. Sometimes it lies in the ability to survive long enough to keep competing after the easiest years have passed. Then Rio arrived. Powell did not contest the individual 100 meters final as he had in Athens, Beijing, or London. His role was now different. In the men's 4x100 meters final, Jamaica lined up Asafa Powell on the first leg, Johan Blake on the second, Nicol Ashmead on the third, and Usain Bolt on the anchor. It was almost a perfect image of Jamaica's sprint journey over more than a decade. Powell, the man who had once put the country on the world 100 meters map before the Bolt era, now opening the race to hand the baton to the generation that had continued to push that legacy further. When the gun sounded, Powell did what he had done all his life: explode out of the blocks. But this time he did not have to carry the entire result on his shoulders alone. His task was to create a strong enough opening segment, deliver a clean baton to Blake, and keep Jamaica in a favorable position. The Jamaican team finished the race in 37.27 seconds and won Olympic gold. Powell finally stood on the highest Olympic podium with an official result defined by victory. After the Beijing 28 relay medal was later stripped from the record, Rio became the remaining Olympic gold in his official achievements. That did not turn Rio into a miracle that could rewrite the entire past. It did not change the fifth place in Athens. It did not turn the Beijing 100 meters into a medal race. It did not heal the London hamstring. It did not make 2013 never happen. A medal, no matter how precious, does not give back the years the body was injured, the championships missed, or the months when reputation was placed under a question mark. But Rio did something else. It gave Powell a final Olympic memory, not built from the word if. Not if he had started better. Not if the body had not hurt. Not if another race had gone differently. In Rio, the results board simply said Jamaica finished first, and the name Asafa Powell was in that lineup. For a man who had grown too used to the Olympics leaving empty spaces, that simplicity perhaps carried its own value. After Rio, Powell's speed gradually no longer had to fight to hold the central position as before. He still competed for many more years, still appeared at meetings, and still carried the reputation of one of the most consistent sub-10-second sprinters in history. But the career began to slow in the natural way that even extraordinary bodies cannot avoid. Finally, in 2022, when he turned 40, Powell announced his retirement. Nearly 2 decades after Athens 24, the man who had lived in a world where a hundredth of a second could change everything no longer had to organize his life around training cycles, treatment rooms, flight schedules, and the starting gun. The stopwatch finally lost the power to decide his days. But retirement did not mean every question disappeared. When he was no longer called up by lane number, no longer had a next race to prove he was still fast, and no longer had a scoreboard to quantify his worth, Powell had to face an entirely different challenge, defining himself outside athletics, outside world records, outside Bolt, and outside everything the world had once demanded of the man who had spent nearly his entire life running faster than almost everyone else. And when the stopwatch no longer decided his life, Asafa Powell entered a phase in which, perhaps for the first time, people could look at him without immediately asking how many seconds he had run. But even today, the way the public remembers Powell is still often reduced to a few easily recognizable fragments: 9.77, 9.74, 9.72, the individual championships he did not win, and the phrase, "the man before Usain Bolt," as if his entire career were only the prologue to another legend. That is how history sometimes treats people who are too good but live in the exact era of someone even more extraordinary. Everything they achieved is viewed through what they did not have. But if those comparisons are set aside, Powell's legacy is far broader. He was once the world record holder in the 100 meters, was named World Athlete of the Year, and was the standard that the strongest sprinters on the planet had to chase. He turned breaking the 10-second barrier into a repeated signature with a frequency rarely seen, maintaining elite speed across many seasons and many phases in which the body continually demanded payment. And more importantly, before the world grew used to Jamaica dominating men's sprinting, Powell had helped place that nation at the center of the global conversation. Before a younger generation turned the Jamaican colors into an image almost synonymous with the 100 meters, Asafa had proven that a man from that small island could own the world's speed standard. But what makes Powell's story deeper after retirement does not lie in how much time he spent defending the past. It lies in the questions he began to ask about the future. Powell has publicly criticized the level of support given to Jamaican athletes, especially the way those who once represented the country can struggle when their careers end. He has said that he turned down large financial opportunities to continue representing Jamaica, and, looking back, there are things that make him rethink the price of that loyalty. More notably, Powell has even questioned whether his children should represent Jamaica in the future if the athlete support system does not change. Hearing those words from a man who once wore the Jamaican colors on the biggest tracks in the world can make many people sad, but disappointment does not necessarily mean turning one's back. There are times when people criticize a place so strongly only because they once loved it enough to hope it would be better. Pride and disappointment can coexist. A person can be grateful to the homeland that made him and still want the athletes who come after not to pay the same price. And perhaps it is here that the true meaning of Asafa Powell's two lives becomes clearest. It was never a dark secret he hid behind closed doors. Those two lives were the gap between the public image people saw and the private price that image demanded. One life measured by the stopwatch, world records, medals and rankings. The other life measured by the people no longer there, the opportunities the body took away, the months when reputation was judged, the responsibility to family, the times he had to start over when youth was no longer long enough to waste. On the track, Powell always had to prove himself with a number. Off the track, no number was enough to explain how much he had endured and still kept going. And that is perhaps the most painful truth about a career often called incomplete. We are too ready to judge a person by the championships they did not win and forget what they had to survive just to be able to step out and compete. Powell does not have an individual Olympic gold. He is not the last name to hold the world record. He also did not escape controversy or the mistakes of a very human life. But greatness is not always the story of someone who never falls. Sometimes greatness lies in the number of times they come back after everything has taken another piece away. Asafa Powell lived nearly a quarter of a century under the light of speed, in a sport that does not allow slowing down, and a world that is rarely patient with imperfection. The world may remember him for 9.77, 9.74, and 9.72. But if we remember only those numbers, we will miss the most important part. The full story of Asafa Powell does not lie in how fast he once ran. It lies in the fact that after loss, injury, disappointment, judgment, and the things he could not control, he still kept walking without letting bitterness become the last thing that defined his name. What makes Asafa Powell's story leave the deepest sadness is not that he lacked an individual Olympic gold medal, but that a man who was once faster than almost everyone else still could not outrun the things life placed in front of him. He lost two older brothers, Michael shot dead in New York, and Vaughn, who died suddenly while playing ball, right as his career was just beginning to open. He became the world record holder with 9.77, then 9.74 seconds, reached 9.72 in the Bolt era, was named World Athlete of the Year. But those numbers could not heal the family, prevent injuries, or protect his reputation when the oxylophrin case of 2013 appeared. Daegu 2011 was especially heartbreaking. Powell held the world's fastest time that season at 9.78, but injury kept him from even stepping into the race. London 2012 was even more ruthless when the hamstring failed right in the middle of the Olympic final. And then the very man used to letting the stopwatch speak for him had to publicly defend the image of a father when his private life was put on the front pages. But Powell still came back, still won relay gold at Rio 2016, and finally stepped off the track without letting the disappointments turn him into a bitter man. For Americans, where success is often measured by titles, money, honors, and the number one position, Powell's story reminds us that a human life cannot be graded by a list of achievements. There are victories that never appear on a podium, continuing to work after losing family members, standing up when reputation is damaged, returning to family after years living under expectation, and being mature enough to demand a better system for the next generation. Asafa Powell did not have a perfect career. That is exactly what makes him more worthy of respect, because he shows that true dignity does not lie in never having fallen, but in still keeping oneself after all the times life forced us to begin again. If Asafa Powell's story makes you look differently at the meaning of strength, please hit subscribe and leave a like so we can continue telling about the people behind whose glory there are always battles few people see. Thank you for walking with us to the end of this journey, and see you in the next video with another story about resilience, loss, and dignity behind the names that once made history.